you have to say, well, if you are trying to explain human behavior, and if your model doesn't incorporate this perspective that I have, then it's an incomplete model. Why say that it's a model of human behavior, but it doesn't include the behavior that I'm now trying to understand, which is female behavior that doesn't fit into this, the kind of the ardent male, passive female model of a lot of the evolutionary psychology's assumptions. And there's been a huge amount of, it's been a terrible fight. Anytime you raise an objection, you say, oh, so you don't believe in evolution. It's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you are trying to box people into ways that don't accommodate all of human nature. So this is a very incomplete system you've got here. And this is the point that I was trying to make. I mean, there's a lot more to it than just this kind of higginess stuff that they were doing. So it's an ongoing debate, though, and I see it online. There are listservs and there are debates. Anytime someone comes up with some criticism of their work, it's like that person doesn't believe in evolution. It just seems like a very unscientific response sometimes. So it's definitely a field that is itself evolving.
Well, if we can talk further with a few examples about the evolutionary psychologist's view of the differences between men and women as passive. And one way this plays out in terms of physiology is talking about females as the default sex, for example, in the development of males and females. So a male, a fetus, if exposed to prenatal androgens, will develop as male. If not exposed, it is the default sex female. And yet there's no explanation for how one becomes female. It's just the default sex, so we don't really need to worry about it. And there's very little that we really understand about the development of the female body.
That's right, yeah.
And we could turn it around in a different way and say, when things go in the usual way, you end up with a female. And when things go slightly amok, and you're exposed to androgens, you get a penis and all this other stuff. And how would that shift what we actually looked at and studied? So there are a number of sort of overlapping issues here in evolutionary psychology and the kinds of questions we ask. And I would be somewhat generous in terms of talking about the ardent male and the passive female. Some of what evolutionary psychology talks about females doing is being choosy, whereas males are fighting with each other or strutting their stuff to attract the attention of the females. Well, what if you go out in the real world and are watching animals or humans as an example of an animal? You can see that male behavior, but how do you measure or assess a female being coy or being choosy? It's much harder to study, so I can see why one draws the attention, whereas the other does not.
Yes, it's true, although there have been some actually interesting recent studies in looking at the difference between, for example, in speed dating. This has been the idea was that women were sitting there at the table and the men sort of going around, and the men would approach, and they always were much more interested in the female than the female would be finicky, she's choosy. What they found was that when they had the men sit and the women go around and approach, that all of a sudden that changed, so that the men became much choosier and the women became more ardent, so that it was just a question more of whether you're waiting or whether you're approaching, how interested you are. If you're approaching a person, you're going to be more likely to feel this sense of attraction towards them, and if you're being approached, you're going to put up your hands a little bit. And they found that that was in fact the response they got. So, and then a lot of other studies that have been done and looking at the different kinds of jealousy, that supposedly men are much more likely to feel sexual jealousy and the women feel emotional jealousy. But then there have been subsequent studies that have shown that in fact, in general, both sexes are likely to feel sexual jealousy. You know, if you hear that your mate has been sleeping around, you're angry. And if you know, if they're sort of feeling, if they're expressing being, you know, oh, I really like this opposite sex friend of mine, you may be a little worried, but it's not until they sleep with them that you suddenly feel, you start to feel really threatened. They actually have shown that. And so, you know, some of these ideas of evolutionary psychology have just, when further studies are done under different conditions, they start to find that they don't hold up. It's not universal. But this is another example. When these new studies come out, on the other side, you have them starting to scream, you know, oh, you don't believe in evolution. I can, you know, every time it's the stock response. But I don't necessarily think that the field of evolutionary psychology is universally bad, by no means. There's been some good work to come out of it. I just think that they have to really be careful and keep an open mind. Another example of, okay, so some of the people that you mentioned about some of the early work that you were talking about at the beginning, transgender and yeah, so the idea is that there's no such thing as a male bisexual. This is like part of the creed of what they insist on. There's no such thing as a male bisexual, because when you do these studies where you're measuring sort of tumescence of the penis in response to different kinds of images, you get either they're responding to male or female. And so they may call themselves heterosexual, but if you see through these tumescence studies that they're actually responding to pictures of naked males, they're not real heterosexual, they just haven't come out of the closet. And this is basically gospel. There's no such thing as a male bisexual because of fantasy. But what is reality? Reality is that there are plenty of male bisexuals. There are plenty of men, including Dean Hamer himself, who had children, who have actually slept with women who have reproduced, and you know, whether they come out when they're younger or older, but they've had sex with women, so they've behaviorally been bisexual. Now, what does natural selection act on? It's not act on your fantasy, it acts on your actions. So to say that there's no such thing as a male bisexual, but it's still happening, it just doesn't make any sense to me, and yet it becomes very rigidly defended for reasons I'm not at all clear about. Why some of these things become gospel and are going to be defended even though the evidence suggests that there's a lot more going on here. So that's where it has to continue to evolve, this field.
When we're talking about sex differences, sexuality, one of the things I sort of feel compelled to bring up is Larry Summers.
Ah, yes.
How can we not talk about Larry Summers? So, for those of you who were in a coma, in January of 2005, and in fact a conference on diversifying science and engineering workforce, then Harvard President Larry Summers made some intentionally provocative comments that were interpreted to mean that he thought that there were innate differences in the ability of men and women that explained the limited number of women in high-level jobs in math and science. And this is not, I mean, this comes back to the issue of science reporting, what was said, who said what, and a story taking off of itself. So, since we're talking about this general issue of sex differences and whatnot, could you comment on your take on what happened with Larry Summers, how the story went out, how it evolved, and what happened to him as a result of that?
Larry Summers spent too much time talking to one of his sort of favorite boys there, Steven Pinker. And Steven Pinker has convinced him that there is this innate difference that you know, oh, well, you find men males clustered more the sort of the genius and the idiot end of the bell curve of intelligence, and also that men are more driven, and so they're sort of more competitive, and there are all these reasons why we would expect to see more men in high-level positions in science. Well, Elizabeth Spelke, who I admire enormously, and she and Steven Pinker had this videotaped wonderful debate over this subject. She looked at all of the data. She really did a very thorough study. She also looked at all of her own data, since she studies how children learn math, among other things. And she said there are no innate differences. There just are none that she could find, and that, she just blames it on, she said, she blames it on sexism that keeps women from going further. And the data just are not at all clear about this. You have differences between countries. You have countries like Finland, where actually males and females perform at the same level. In fact, females slightly higher. You have differences between the top performers in Asian countries and European and the United States. There's just, the data are all over the map, but there's no way that the president of Harvard should get up there and say, oh, by the way, I'm pretty convinced that it's genetic, which is what he did. He really did. Even though he tried to say that that's not what he was saying. But when you look at the transcript, he was very clearly stating allegiance to that perspective, that the real important reason for the disparity in high-level women in science, the real important reasons were differences in native mathematical ability, in competitive levels, and in, just willingness to work the kind of hours and give everything else up for the sake of science. And so I thought that was actually, I thought he should not have become Obama's, when Obama chose him for his cabinet for a while. It's like, why? This guy really, I think he made a really major blunder with that whole Harvard business, and I think it sets people back. I think it's discouraging for young women in science. I think to constantly talk about these innate differences when the data are not there to support the case, why do that? What's going to be gained by that?
What's going to be gained by that is that women will underperform according to expectations.
Yeah. So I actually think he made a big boo-boo there, I have to say. That was a big mistake he made when he came out at that conference and said that. So if he paid for it, he should have. It was not, for the president of Harvard to talk that way was, I think, pretty serious. So now I sound like an advocacy journalist. I know. But
Well, I'm getting signs that it's getting to be close to time to wrap up this part of what we're talking about.
Okay.
But I have to admit to some jealousy, because as we spoke about at dinner, you get, part of your job, you get to read a lot. And you get to talk to the premier scientists of our time. And you've had a first row seat on some of these discoveries and seen some of these things for yourself. So just as a chief whiz moment that you would like to share, one of the more amazing, unexpected things that you've seen?
Well, one of the most amazing things that, actually, I do talk to brilliant scientists, and I love it. It's just amazing. But also my encounters with animals, those have been very exciting. I can tell you that being able to, for example, go up to the treetops. One of the things in Panama, right, up in the trees, which is where a lot of animals live, and when you talk about arboreal, it means not only that they live in the trees, but they never come down to the ground. And this is something that I hadn't really appreciated. But there are animals that spend their entire lives up in the trees, and you never get to see them, especially if they're nocturnal. So one of the most exciting trips that I ever had was working with this photographer who had these scaffolds constructed that brought you up to the top of the canopy, And we were able to spend the entire nights out there with the animals as they came up there during the flowering of the, these are these balsa wood trees, where these flowers that look like just these giant goblets. And every evening at about 3, 4 o'clock, the tree fills it up with this nectar. I mean, really, it's like this thing just fills up like as though there's some bartender there spritzing. And it fills up, and so all of these different animals come through and take their rounds at these nectar-filled goblets. And we were up there in the trees with them, just watching as this whole series of the whole forest came up there, and just being there and watching that happening. And the most amusing one, though, were the white-faced capuchin monkeys, which were really pissed off to see us up there. I mean, these are monkeys who are used to seeing the researchers, down there on the ground where they can throw things at you, right? And they come up here to the top of the trees, and we're already there, and you could just see the irritation on their faces. That was a wonderful moment. These are the organ grinder monkeys, are very smart. And the other one was shaking hands with an octopus. Now that is another experience. Because it wraps its tentacle around you and then feels you up and down with its suckers, and you can just feel that moving along there. And it was just like, whoa, we never felt anything like that. So these are the kinds of little privileges of reporting about science that I wouldn't trade for anything.
Well, thank you. We're ready to open for Q&A, so go for it.
Hello. You mentioned earlier that you do have to be careful about the amount of advocacy in anything you do within writing. Has there ever been a moment where you just kind of stopped and really wanted to write in favor of something or get something and you just couldn't too much?
Yes, there have been. Now you're going to want an example of that. But there have definitely been times when I've wanted to say something and I couldn't. I mean, I know that comes up a lot with, definitely, I have to admit, with religion. And when it comes up and I want to just say something, I desist. And also, if you feel like politically that one side or the other is actually to blame, you can't necessarily come out and state that. So if you feel that the Republican Party is actually holding back progress on a particular, and I do think that at this point they're likely to be the party holding back, but this is not always the case, and certainly the left has had their own issues with science that I get. The whole anti-vaccine crowd, let me tell you, that is a real problem. The anti-genetically modified foods, there are some other issues that I think unscientific thinking is not necessarily a partisan issue. So there have been cases like that. But yeah, so things where you do want to cast blame. You do have to resist doing that.
Yeah.
You touched briefly several times on the role of scientists. Most recently in the discussion, you just mentioned that, quote unquote, the male scientists have the drive to be in the lab all the constantly, sacrifice their life for science. And the gratitude of that, not questioning, that's not true.
I'm not saying that that's something I believe. I'm saying that was an argument being made.
But I do feel that it is overall generally accepted that scientists have to generally dedicate themselves to their work. There's a very strong that scientists do have to commit strongly to science. And I guess, how does that fit in with also the requirement that scientists be more outreaching and fit into the wider political sphere? Because I feel like there's a strong distance between scientists there's a wide gap between scientists that do science and scientists that don't do science, or were formerly, have PhDs but no longer in research. And so I personally feel there has to be a shift. What do you think that shift has to be, and how do you think we should do it?
The shift being that scientists should have more time to do outreach and not have to only be in the lab all the time. Well, I think that's true, and more of these grants now are making that a requirement of getting the money, that you have to spend a certain amount of time on public outreach. And one of the difficulties is that Carl Sagan used to complain about this. He was never, for example, he never was elected to the National Academy of Sciences because he spent a lot of time, obviously, on trying to inspire people about science, and he paid the price in his reputation among other scientists. And this continues to be an issue, that scientists who spend too much of their time doing this kind of outreach are looked on as not as serious about their science. But that's starting to change. And why is it starting to change? Because scientists are going to have to start doing more outreach for the sake of getting money. And so you have this movement, this crowdfunding of science, which is really picking up steam in a hurry, because a lot of young scientists are finding that there's no other way to get money. The first time grant from the NIH is now, the age of first grant is 42, which is just ludicrous for a scientific career. So more and more scientists are finding they're going to have to go and do just basically asking for money more generally, which usually means some form of real serious outreach, putting together a pretty good video explaining your work to the general public. So I think that the economic demand is going to lead to it being much more acceptable for scientists to spend a lot of time talking to the public, because that's the only way they're going to get money. It's just going to be the economic model, which is, on the one hand it's bad that people have to scrounge around. On the other hand, if it means that there's going to be more of a connection between scientists and the public, that has its silver lining here.
So I'm in the environmental research field, and when you come across a lot of persons, these pitted battles and studies, particularly in the field of toxicology, or climate change is the famous one, or fracking. There's also battles about certain plastics, lack of human health, or fire retardant, child. So the science journalists, and the battles of whether the science is sponsored by corporations that benefit from it. So as a science journalist, how do you navigate those battles?
They're difficult, and people complain about science of journalism generally being too much of this he said, she said, trying to give both sides. But because a lot of these issues that you mentioned, something like fracking is a perfect example of to what extent does fracking, harmful chemicals, to what extent is it causing earthquakes, all of these issues. The best that you can do as a science writer, since you're certainly not going to be able to settle the issue, and you're not going to have the expertise, all you can do is talk to people and try to use your good judgment and get some weighted sample here, and then present it in that weighted manner. So if there is one side that is perhaps a little bit more, has a little bit more of the evidence on their side, that's how you present it. That's the best you can do. You cannot settle the issue for anybody. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff, especially in the environment, where it's still being sorted out. Fracking is a perfect example of that. But we can't solve that problem. We can just report it as best we can, and that comes through doing good reporting and through presenting the story, not necessarily as an even-handed story if it isn't, but if it's 60-40, 70-30, whatever it happens to be, that's the best that you can do.
About the crowdsourcing that you were talking about earlier, do you have any
Well, yeah, I mean, there's been a bunch of examples of it. Actually, some guy just sent me recently his study, trying to understand certain kinds of mites that infect ants, and that they have a lot of impact on ant behavior. And he actually put together something really cool on it. He raised a lot of money for it, so he's able to continue his research on these mites. And there have been a number of studies done with studying behavior, studying, I actually just heard about one the other day that raised a huge amount of money. And it was also medically related. So there have been a number of cases where people have earned as much as $250,000 to $500,000 crowdsourcing, but most of the others have been in the order of, hundreds to thousands of dollars, which isn't much for a lot of kinds of science. But on the other hand, especially for things like field research, that can go a long way. The question is, are we going to be able to fund major, serious, sustained basic research on crowdsourcing? Probably not, but at least it is a new way of bringing money in, and it's something to consider for young scientists to keep them going until the United States gets its act back in order, and so more of the money goes back to NIH, back to NSF, that we start to devote more of our resources to scientific research. But in the meantime, it can be a good stopgap measure. But it is smaller scale.
Do you think that the crowdsourcing brings a new kind of person into science that otherwise wouldn't be naturally interested in it?
Yes, definitely. I think as with doing these kinds of citizen science activities, I think that when people start to read about, and there are several of these websites that do this for science. When people go and read these projects and see the proposals and videos posted and so on, I think they very much feel like they're part of the enterprise. Now, this is something that they hadn't necessarily felt before, although I wish they would, because in fact, science almost invariably belongs to all of us, because most of it is paid for by us. So it is ours, but I think only through this much more direct connection do people suddenly say, oh, wow, and then they start reading more. I know I've directed several people that I know who, for various reasons, not scientists, to these places, and they start reading through all these proposals. It's like, wow, I had no idea that so many people were out there asking these interesting questions. So I do think that it's a positive sign of getting people to pay more attention. Yeah, it's a good development. So I'd like to see some way in which it really becomes sustained engagement in the public through these kinds of measures. And I also think that the internet has helped, where people can, well, now for example, people can look at data for discovering exoplanets that might be this right sort of Goldilocks planet to harbor life. And so NASA has these programs now where they will get anyone who's interested in looking for habitable planets. They'll give you all the basically all this data that they have, and you can start looking through it for patterns. And people have done that. Apparently there have been 2 or 3 publications of these planets that have depended on citizen science input. And I think that there's going to be more and more of that. So to the extent that scientists can keep that in mind when designing their research protocol, that's all to the good of everybody. I'm very optimistic about that.
So I'm a neuroscience major, and I'm planning on doing neuroscience research as a career. And I was just sort of wondering, I'm in a feminism science class, and we've been talking a lot about sort of how women obviously are equal in science, and then you were mentioning how the world of science in general scientists are sort of becoming more and more discouraged. I'm still obviously very interested, but what are your words of encouragement, especially for me as a female scientist, or specifically neuroscientist, to sort of change things and continue on with our aspirations?
My word of encouragement is that, well, maybe there are two questions here, whether you should be a scientist at all.
I mean, no, I'm pretty sure I want to be a scientist.
Yeah.
That's not the question.
Whether you should study female brain or.
Well, just in general, like, what are your words of encouragement, or you know, what are ways that we can get more involved? Besides, you've already talked about policy, to sort of change the way that both women are seen in the field of science, as well as scientists in the field of science, in the field of the world, in the context of the world.
I think the more women that go into science and stay in science, the better. And it's obviously been happening. And the numbers are going up, although much slower than we would have liked, especially at the higher levels. They remain below what we would have liked. But I think I would encourage anybody who's doing science. It's just a great job. I mean, it really is. And it's a privileged life. You know, one of the things I actually really strongly believe, and I'm not a religious person, but I do believe that we have a moral obligation to use this gift of consciousness and ability to understand the world, that we continue to explore the world and to try to understand it. And as a scientist, you're at the very forefront of that. And you know, just pushing knowledge forward is your obligation as a human being. If you could do it, you should do it. So think of it that way. Think of it as almost like a calling rather than even just a career, which is also a great thing. But it's a calling, and if you are trained in it and you have the ability to do it, you know, you should just, no matter what obligations come into, what impediments come up, you should pursue it. Now, Vera Rubin talked about that. She's an astronomer, very well known for her work on dark matter. You know, people say, oh, but it's so hard to be an astronomer and there's so few jobs. And she says, if you love it, you do it, it will work for you. And you know, that's a little bit Pollyannish maybe, but at the same time, if you have that passion and if you're doing it, I think it will work for you. You know, figuring out how to make it work together with your family obligations. This is difficult, but maybe things are improving there a little bit too. For example, NIH already has this program in place where if you have a grant and you need to take time off for maternity leave, the clock stops then. So if you have a 5-year grant and you have to take off, you know, a year or whatever it is, the clock is stopped and you resume it and it keeps going. That's NIH. The NSF is doing the same thing now. So, you know, things like that are happening that I think are an encouraging sign and an awareness that women in science do great work, but sometimes they need something like that, just because biologically we are still the ones who have the children. So I think that that's encouraging. But mostly I just think, yeah, you have an ethical obligation as a trained and observant scientist to just keep pushing forward. I really believe that. I mean, I like other species like octopuses, but they can't really figure out what's going on in the exoplanets, and so I think we can do it.
You already talked a little bit about how there's sort of this gap between public science literacy and scientists, but I feel that there's also this problem within the science community that science is getting like very, very technical. And I know that like myself as a molecular biology student, if you hand me sort of like an inorganic chemistry paper or something coming straight out of like a physics journal, I'm not really going to be able to understand that very well. So I was wondering how you navigate sort of that problem. And then also, to some extent, that very much compounds this idea that there's a gap between the public and scientists, because if you have, science being reported at almost a high school level or something that a high schooler can understand, how are we ever going to get to a place where like the newest science, which only, you know, a molecular biologist who's studying tetrahymena and like gene modification can understand?
Well, that's a good point, and in fact, this came up earlier that I think one of the differences that scientists, even when they're talking to someone in a completely different field, like you talking to a particle physicist or whatever it may be, that you, first of all, maybe you don't feel as intimidated, so you don't feel as though you're not entitled to even ask the questions of this person that you're presumably talking to. But if you're talking about reading their journals, well, that you probably are not going to be able to do that, but we have a limited lifespan anyway, and there's so many things that we can't read that we'd like to. I think scientists should be able to explain what they're doing very clearly in lay language, not just for the sake of explaining to lay people, but because my experience is that scientists who cannot describe their research to somebody in clear lay language are still a little fuzzy in their own minds about what they're actually doing. And that the higher the level of scientists, this has been my experience at least, that they tend to be very good at also explaining their research because they've thought it through themselves. Everything that they're doing, you know, they sort of tried to put the pieces together, and a lot of them have experience writing grants too, and sometimes they have to be much more general than their papers are. So scientists should be able to explain what they're doing, and they should be able to explain it at any number of levels of, you know, sophistication. And maybe we just need to have more of that.